this video I'm gonna show the process of this thumbnail that you see here, and I'm gonna try and explain what I'm doing as I'm painting, and probably there's gonna be some music at some point because I'm not gonna be talking the whole time. So I'm starting with the biggest shapes, just thinking about value. I like separating the value and the color and just start with big shapes when I'm setting up the composition and the design. So I'm starting with the mid-ground value here on one layer and just creating these ruins. And for this thumbnail, I don't really have an in-depth story here. It's more like ruins in the desert, and I have some references that I'm looking at. What I just did, I created like the main shape of these ruins, and then I made it into a brush and used it again for another shape. That way you can quickly reuse the same shapes and then change them around. Just kind of a quick way to, not drawing everything from scratch. And when I do this, I'm starting with the biggest shapes, and I'm looking to see the relationships between the shapes and just create a cool composition. Thinking about some composition ideas, guidelines, the rule of thirds, trying to lead the eye to my focal point, choosing a specific focal point. In this case, it's the ruins there. And really everything else that's not the focal point, I'm not gonna spend as much time on it, and I'm not gonna make it draw too much attention, because you want all the attention going to your focal point. And maybe if you have a secondary focal point, you can have another one, but it has to be clear what's the main focal point. So I have some ruins in the foreground as well. Right now I'm creating some kind of a trail. It's always nice to have some kind of a trail in your composition, because it could lead the eye and also could really sell that perspective. So it's kind of like a depth cue that you can use, because it's going to recede into the horizon line, and it's one of the ways to really push your perspective. So at the beginning here I had the clouds, like the more horizontal clouds, which was cool, but right now I'm trying something else with the clouds, maybe these more circular clouds, and it kind of emphasized my focal point. Now I'm starting to work on kind of like the light shapes within the silhouetted shape that I created. I'm thinking about the light direction, but mostly I'm thinking about design right now, because I'm trying to design some of the details. And sometimes I would actually sketch with like lines to figure this out, but sometimes I just paint right away, and it kind of it frees you from drawing. Really, you you can focus more on just the shapes and see what you can communicate with just shapes. So I'm thinking about some windows, and I have some references for the type of ruins. So I'm looking at my references, but I'm not copying the reference. I'm trying to take what I like and maybe leave out other stuff, and then maybe push some of the shapes to make them a bit more stylized, maybe. And as I'm painting like that, if there's like a section that I like, maybe I'll copy it and then use it again and then change it a little bit. So I'm not painting everything from scratch all the time. And right now I kind of adjusted the perspective. At some point I'm going to use a grid here to make sure the perspective kind of works. So having a grid somewhere is always going to help. But if you have experience with perspective, you could start without a grid, and then if there's something specific you want to work on and make sure the perspective works, then you can use the grid. And then with like a structure, you need a bit more perspective than with natural forms like trees and mountains and rocks, even though there's perspective there as well. Using the same shapes, creating further away ruins. And the good thing about, other than saving time when you copy these shapes, the good thing about it is you're actually using the same shape language. So the starting point is the same, and then you make some changes so it doesn't look duplicated, but you're kind of creating a shape language when you're doing that. And here's my grid. I'm using here just a 1-point perspective grid just to make sure my perspective is working. And I'm continuing that trail, and it's leading the eye to the focal point. I'm not saying you have to have a trail in your composition, but you can, and it's something that can help. So once I have my foreground, midground, and background, I'm starting to paint inside these shapes, and then I'm just thinking about the light parts and the shadow parts. I'm thinking about the light direction, but also the shapes I'm creating, because everything, it's not just about getting it right in terms of where the light is coming from and does it look realistic enough, or does it work in terms of the light. It also, for me, needs to work in terms of the shapes. Everything needs to be designed. And it's still kind of rough. Everything is rough. I'm not getting into any crazy details. I'm just, the idea of a thumbnail is to show a clear direction and a clear statement without getting into too much details. Working on the foreground ruins now. That's another thing that you can use to force depth, is kind of repeat some elements that you have in the background and then show what they look like closer. And also it's just kind of nice to have some kind of a more detailed element in your foreground. So right now I'm painting some of the darkest parts, and I'm using that to create some texture. And with this foreground element, with these shapes on the right, I'm always thinking about not making shapes compete. So, avoiding equal spacing or equal height or equal thickness. And, maybe sometimes you want to create stuff that's going to be equal. But if it's not the purpose of the design, then I try to avoid it. Adding some kind of a character right now for the sake of scale. Maybe a little bit of story, but not much, honestly. So making sure the character is working with the general lighting of the scene, the light direction. Right now I'm adjusting the size of my focal point. It just seemed, not dramatic enough, not interesting enough, maybe too similar. Everything was kind of similar in size. So making these ruins a lot bigger, I think it's a little bit more interesting. Also, it's cropped, so some of it is actually not in the page, and it kind of creates the illusion that the world is actually bigger than the frame. Another idea that I started thinking about as I was painting is maybe creating some kind of a rock around the character to kind of frame the character. But I think I ended up not going ahead with this idea. It seemed a little bit too forced. Adding some birds for scale. Also, every time I see a concept art with some kind of a structure or ruins like that, there's always birds like that, and I don't know, it looks cool. But it's mostly for scale. Now finally I'm flipping the canvas just to make sure I'm seeing everything there is to see in terms of my shapes. It's always good to flip, and I need to constantly remind myself to do that because I kind of forget doing that. And you can identify mistakes when you're doing that. So I'm gonna paint like that a little bit and then go back at some point. So flipping back and forth really helps. I have the focal point and I have the foreground. That's pretty much established. I have a little bit between the focal point and the foreground. This midground area is a little bit less defined. Ended up adding some dust there just to create some kind of a better silhouette for the character. And this is as far as I took this thumbnail. I think it's good enough for a thumbnail.